Right, everyone, welcome to our only, I'm going to do one more, I promise, lecture while I'm in Greece. Finished Turkey, and I'm in Greece now. And actually, I'm on the trip with this guy, Taylor Terzak. Taylor does a really good job of putting together things to help make sense of complicated topics. And sometimes this can be a complicated topic. And as soon as I saw Taylor discuss it in the way he did, I was like, oh, I'm going to steal that PowerPoint, and told him. So I guess it's not really stealing, but this is Taylor's stuff, and we're gonna go over it. And so there's a lot of slides. A lot of them go quick because they're moving quick. But if you have any questions, make sure you message me or save them for class. Either one. All right. So John Piper in future. All right, so I'm sorry you can't see this. It looks like there was a filter put on the background and it's not coming through, but I'll read you the text and I'll post the PowerPoint in the Canvas so you'll be able to see it. But this is a quote on this page. It says, God meant gratitude to be a spontaneous expression of pleasure in the gift and the goodwill of another. He did not mean it to be an impulse to return favors. That's an important line. We'll come back to it. If gratitude is twisted into a sense of debt, it gives birth to the debtor's ethic, and the effect is to nullify grace. So what you'll notice here is that what John Piper is saying is that grace, to be grace, has to be free. There can't be any strings attached. Okay, again, listen to it carefully. If gratitude is twisted into a sense of debt, it gives birth to the debtor's ethic, as if me giving you something requires you to give something back. And Piper's saying it can't be that way. That's completely inappropriate. He goes on to say, if grace is to be free, which is the very meaning of grace, see how we define it there? We cannot view it as something to be repaid. If grace is to be free, which is the very meaning of grace, we cannot view it as something to be repaid. And I imagine many of you, this is kind of how you have envisioned grace or been told about grace. It's God's free gift. Okay? That's something that consistently is part of it. And this leads us to this idea that it is a non-circular assumption. Okay? The problem is, this is not how grace was thought of in the ancient world. Greco-Roman world, the social bond of benefactor and beneficiary worked together. So the benefactor would give gifts, favor, and benefits to the beneficiary, who would give loyalty, thanks, and allegiance back to the benefactor. And this created a bond between the two. Think about the way this works in our world today, right? If someone invites you to something, you tend to invite them to something. If someone gives you a birthday present, you tend to give them a birthday present, right? If someone pays for a meal for you, you tend to want to pay for a meal for them. And in so doing, it creates a social bond. Another way to think about it is if I go to my neighbor and say, hey, I need a cup of sugar because I'm making a cake. The appropriate response is not to take a cup of sugar over to them in my little 1 cup measuring thing so they can put it in their thing, right? That would be weird. What's the appropriate response is to, one, give them a piece of the cake because like they helped make it, and two, when they ask for eggs next time and I've got them, I give them to them, and it creates a social bond. That's what we're looking for here. The non-circular assumption, when we read of grace in Paul, we have to reverse our assumption because we think of it as non-circular. We should assume, unless there's a strong evidence to the contrary, gifts carry expectation of return. This is the work of John Barclay. We'll talk about him as we go. So if you hear me talk about John Barclay, it probably has to do with this book. This book came out about 9 years ago now, and it is considered one of the most important books in biblical scholarship in the past 50 years. It's way up there. And this idea that we should assume, unless there is a strong evidence to the contrary, that gifts carry expectations of return. That's something we should remember when we talk about grace. Schwartz claims that the Jews rejected reciprocity, and he labels them as anti-reciprocal. Is that true, though? Is there any evidence the Jewish people rejected reciprocity? As in, when we talk about reciprocity, this goes back to that idea that if you give someone a gift, they have to reciprocate and then give you a gift or respond in some way. And to go back, that's that idea of the beneficiary rewarding the benefactor with those things like loyalty, thanks, and allegiance. So when we look at that, let's look at what the Old Testament actually says. Sorry, you can't see it too well. You should be able to see it on the PowerPoint. If you look, you can just listen to me and look at that if you want to. When you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It should be left for the alien, the orphan, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all your undertakings. There's this idea, like, yeah, this is non-reciprocity. But here's the problem with that, right? It looks like non-reciprocity. But when you give to the poor, what are you doing? You're giving so that God may bless you in all your other undertakings. In other words, contrary to Shorts, this is what John Barclay says, Jewish giving to the poor is fully enmeshed in the expectation of reciprocity, and its distinctive elements are justified not by an anti-reciprocal ethos, not that you just give to the poor so that you don't get anything, but it's the modulation of the reciprocity ethos into the expectation of reciprocity from God. A lot of big words. So what are we saying here? It's this idea that just because they're not expecting something in return from the poor does not mean they're not expecting something in return. In fact, they are giving to the poor because in giving to the poor, they are expecting a return from God himself. And this isn't foreign to Christianity either, right? We're talking about Jewish reciprocity here. But if we're talking about how it works overall, this is also what it looks like in the Christian life. Because Jesus says, whatever you've done for the least of these, you have done for me, right? And those are the ones who get to enter into the kingdom. We'll talk more about that when we get to that section of Matthew. But this is that reciprocity. It's I do something for you so that you will do something for me. And this is fully enmeshed in the Greco-Roman world. This is fully enmeshed in the Jewish world. And for some reason, us in Western Christianity have missed it. We have forgotten about it. So let's look a little bit at how we can look at grace. All right. So there's a couple of different things going on here, and I want to talk about each one of them. So on the uh, left-hand side, on the y-axis, as it were, we have perfections of grace. And we'll talk more about these as we go. So we have the perfections of grace, and then across the top we have the different Second Temple writings. So the Wisdom of Solomon is the Second Temple writing, Philo, the Qumran Hodayot, Pseudo-Philo, and Fourth Ezra. You'll notice that each one of them, right, as I circle down, talks about superabundance. What does that mean? Well, Paul says this in his letter to the Romans, where he says, where sin abounds, grace abounds more, right? This is the superabundance, that no matter what, God's grace is enough. That's superabundance, okay? Priority is the next thing. So the priority is who acts first in the relationship. Does God act first or does humanity act first? And you'll notice we have 3 in which the priority is that God acts first. In Wisdom of Solomon and 4 Ezra, you'll notice again that there's nothing here. These indicate that the priority is on human to act first, and God responds. We'll talk more about that as we go. The incongruity of grace, only the Qumran Hodayot and Pseudo-Philo have incongruity, and this is the idea that God's grace is bigger, that it's not something that we can earn in the sense that we can do something for it, right? This is something that we've talked about and we'll talk about, that in the Second Temple period, it was kind of a question on whether you could earn God's grace. And you'll notice that Philo, Wisdom of Solomon, and Fourth Ezra don't have this idea as much, right? So there's a little bit of a conversation there, but I should note that it's not that you can earn God's grace in the sense that you can do enough to be worthy of it. but that you can do things to make yourself more worthy. Okay, it's a weird place, but it's important. Efficacy. Can God's grace do what it wants? And you'll see here that Philo and the Qumran Hodiot both talk about that. The singularity, I don't remember what singularity is. It's not as important. But what is really important in this slide is the superabundance. Obviously, everyone has that. God's grace is always enough. And the second thing is not a single one of these second temple texts indicate that grace is non-circular. Grace requires a response. Always. That's what this is telling us. Grace always requires a response. So, this is language about Paul. Again, sorry about the background. It says, therefore, not only as one swimming in the cognitive river of Greco-Roman culture, which we already talked about, but also as a good Jew within the diversity of Second Temple Judaism, we can assume Paul's default was that of reciprocity in gift giving. Second Temple period, Greco-Roman period, the reciprocity is important. So we have to assume that that reciprocity is baked in to what Paul understands and believes about grace. So going back to that earlier picture, you'll see that this is how the reciprocity of grace looks like in Paul's letters. It's a covenantal bond, not a social bond as much. It is, but it's covenantal. Like it's another level of that bond. God gives the Christ gift to everyone. And in return, they give faith and love to God. Now, we talked about this a little bit, but in that reciprocity idea, Barclay notes that in the Greco-Roman period, see if I can get that better, that a gift wasn't received unless it was returned. This was a vital part of the gift-giving cycle, that there had to be a return on the gift. And in the Christian idea, this is the return. Faith and love are what we give back. That's how that works. So, there are some nuances, of course. Reciprocation is framed as actualizing the Christ gift. So if we go back, that's the actual, it's not, it doesn't happen. The gift isn't complete until it's reciprocated. Reciprocation is the actualizing that it makes it an actual gift. Further, it not only actualizes it, but it also perpetuates it and extends it. So let's look at what that looks like. So, God gives the Christ gift to all people, and that love then moves over to the other circle so that all people love each other. And that's how the Christ gift is manifested. This continual action is how we continue in faith. And Paul frames the direction of reciprocity more towards others than simply back towards God the giver. Or in other words, this section here is this, that love for God is love for all people. Love for God is love for all people. Now, faith, that's something we give to God. But the love that we give to others is how we love God. And this is how grace works, or how Paul understands grace to work. And because Paul understood it that way and wrote it, and it's in our Bible, this is the way we should understand it as well. That Christ gives himself for all people. The command he gives is to love God and to love people. And by following this command and by having faith in God, we actualize the Christ gift. And we'll talk more about that as we go. And you might be thinking, Matt, does that mean that I have to do things in order to get grace? There does seem to be this conversation going on, right? And this isn't just Pauline. This is also what James says. James says, you show me your faith, I'll show you my works. What does he mean by that? Well, if you read James, those works come down to love of all people. It's weird how the text just kind of works itself out and works itself together. So we want to make sure that we're looking at this that way. So the different uses of charis, or grace, suggest that divine grace flows through believers and expressed in giving to others, and that momentum of this flow generates thanks to God in recognition of the source of the gift. So again, the Christ gift, through it among believers, love, back to God with thanksgiving, and it just continues. So let's look at 2 Corinthians 6:9. As we work together with him, we urge you not to accept the grace of God in vain, right? Knowing there is no restriction in our affections, but only in yours. In return, I speak as to children. Open wide your hearts also. What is Paul saying? We're giving you grace, and we'll end up. Well, in 8:1-2, he says, we want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that has been granted to the churches of Macedonia. For during a severe ordeal of affliction, their abundant joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. They understand that grace requires giving. And this not merely as we expected. They gave themselves first to the Lord, and by the will of God to us. Notice both of those. So that we might urge Titus that, as he had already made a beginning, so he should also complete this generous undertaking among you. Now, as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in utmost eagerness, and in our love for you, so we want you to excel in this generous undertaking. I do not say this as a command, but I am testing the genuineness of your love against the earnestness of others. For you know the generous act, Karine, of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, that by his poverty you might become rich. And God is able to provide you with every blessing in abundance, so that by always having enough of everything, you may share abundantly in every good work. So, this grace, this gift that they're trying to raise, this money that they're trying to raise for the Jerusalem church, Paul is saying this money that we're trying to raise for the Jerusalem church to give them so that they can feed the people they need to feed in their time of famine, this is your response to God's grace. Your response to God's grace is giving to those in need. That's what Paul is saying in this section of 2 Corinthians 6-9. So, Paul thus combines, this is what Barclay says at the end. Paul thus combines two features that appear paradoxical only to us. On the one hand, he perfects the incongruity of the gift, its donation to those unfitting to be its recipients. You do not do anything to earn this. Incongruity. On the other, he presumes its strongly obligating character, reorienting the allegiance to those whom it is given. Paul perfects the incongruity of the gift given to the unworthy, but he does not perfect its non-circularity, expecting nothing in return. The divine gift in Christ, this is a very important line. I'm going to highlight it on the page, even if you can barely see it, because I do think it's absolutely that important. Let's see if I can find it. The divine gift in Christ was unconditioned, based on no prior condition, but is not unconditional, carrying no subsequent demands. That's a very, very important line. The divine gift was unconditioned, but it is not unconditional. You can't do anything to earn this, but there are conditions to the gift. I know you're going to have questions. After you've watched this, come into class, we'll talk about them, we'll have a good time. I think this is really important understanding Paul. That's why I wanted to make sure that we had this conversation. Let me know, again, you can email me with questions and I'll keep them in a queue and we can go over them when I get back. Thanks everyone for watching this. I appreciate all of you. Have a wonderful whatever day you're watching this.